Okay, so shall I go ahead and give a little bit of introduction to why we're doing these calls? Basically, is sort of a pilot test series of OpenClimate calls, where we are sort of trying to understand the relationship between the open movement and the climate crisis. So it's a little bit of a set of exploration calls. We had 2 of these calls already, and this is the third one with Lisa and Alex, well, and also Emma from CDKN, and Alex from the Wikimedia Foundation. And the last 2 you can find on the Appropedia page that Shannon just shared there, or that I will share in a moment. And we're also doing a little bit of a summary of these calls on Medium. And the idea is that we are convening these meetings sort of like exploring a set of questions. And so for this conversation, we have Alex Stinson from the Wikimedia Foundation and senior strategist from the Wikimedia Foundation, and then Lisa McNamara and Emma Baker from the Climate and Development Knowledge Network and South-South-North. I hope I introduced you two correctly. If not, please feel free to correct me. So Lisa, do you want to go ahead?
Okay, great. I'm not sure if it was my connection, but I will just share my screen quickly. Can you see that? Yeah. Okay, great. So I'm just going to be talking a bit about our experiences around what we're seeing as like key knowledge gaps in our work. So it's very much from a program implementation perspective, as opposed to quite, we're working with developing countries and with decision makers and a range of different actors in these places. So it's very sort of decision-led kind of gaps that are emerging rather than content gaps per se. So I hope that's okay. And I can talk a bit about our audiences as well. And so I suppose these are more than global level gaps. They're more sort of region, country level, local level gaps. But I think there's a lot of crossover across the board, actually. So just a brief background, CDKN has been going for 10 years. We're a network. We're very much focused on knowledge brokering recently. We have 3 regional offices. We work in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and we are funded by the Canadian government, IDRC, and the Dutch government. And we're very much focused on trying to link knowledge and action on climate change. We do a lot of knowledge tailoring. We work in 9 focal countries, and we try to match it to needs. And so we're very needs driven and very demand driven. And we also focus on supporting peer learning, leadership, empowering of champions in the global South to act on climate change. So our engagement thus far in the open movement, we did for a number of years convene the Climate Knowledge Brokers Group. I'm not sure if anyone's familiar with that group, and it really was an alliance of the global, regional, national knowledge brokers across the world. And the aim was to improve access to climate information through collaboration of knowledge brokers. So a lot of projects emerged from that, and a few nice initiatives. And now the group is being hosted by We Adapt. It has scaled down quite a bit, but it's still going to an extent. And then now, more recently, CDKN has been engaging, and that's how we came to meet Alex and Evelyn through the work we've been doing in dabbling with Wikipedia, which has been really exciting for us. And we've been working with our sort of sister program, Future Climate for Africa, which is a science program focused on the region and improving science on Africa, climate science on Africa. And we've been really focusing on trying to directly support climate researchers and experts in the global South to contribute to Wikipedia. We had a face-to-face Africa event back in the days when we could meet face to face. And then we had a 7-day online editathon last year, Wiki for Climate. Can't believe it's last year already. And we've also produced a guide, which Evelyn's very thankfully translated into Spanish for us. And I think updated and probably improved a bit. So specifically for climate professionals on how to contribute to Wikipedia, because we saw this real gap that the climate community hadn't really sort of gotten to grips with the Wikipedia and power of the Wikipedia tool as a communications tool. So some nice impacts from that is that this is a sort of a testimonial from a blog written by a participant of Wiki for Climate, Sumana, and she's a researcher in India, and she wrote a blog on her experiences and was totally unsolicited. And this just gives you a sense of the sense of empowerment that she felt, being able to contribute to this global platform and share her research and the research she came across, and her local evidence base on a global platforms, which I thought was really nice sort of illustration of the importance of bringing new contributors to Wikipedia. So where are we seeing key kind of knowledge gaps? I think a lot of this is not really new. We know this. Increasingly, climate researchers, particularly in the adaptation space, are calling for more people-centered, place-based knowledge that can really integrate with the top-down modeling being done. And it's messy, but this bottom-up, top-down integration really needs to happen urgently and at scale. So in terms to take that to more of a granular level, of course, there's still a lot of need for the science, but highly applied, we're finding, at very downscaled levels, national, subnational, where people, where decision makers can plan at a national, subnational, municipal level, at watershed level, and really tailored in very accessible formats to needs. There's still a lot of climate risk, it seems obvious, but information on local and district level vulnerability and risk is still something that's very much needed, and tools to do that effectively are very much needed and often very process heavy to really map out the vulnerabilities and understand them. There's a lot about what works, what's working, what adaptation and mitigation best practices, technologies, innovations are working. And Apropedia is like a nice, interesting platform for that. And yeah, so there's really lots of need for that. Intersectionality, more and more and more. How is climate change impacting different social groups and genders, and not just men and women, but ethnic minorities and transgender communities and people with disabilities. So there's a whole really sort of becoming more nuanced in how we understand the community. Indigenous knowledge systems and how they can be integrated, and often it's oral knowledge we're talking about. This deep need for information in different languages, which I know the Wikipedia community is very familiar with, that we're encountering all the time. And as soon as we do something that's not English, it just flies. And then Climate 101, really, for local community groups. I think there's actually quite a lot of need for understanding the big picture with local community groups, and there's quite a lot of demand for understanding how the negotiations work. What is my government doing to respond to climate change, and the sort of Climate 101 for those groups. So we know there's definitely a huge upsurge in activity around the open movement. I know last week we were in knowledge. There's a project called CE4CAP. I'm not sure if everyone, KE, not CE, familiar with it, knowledge exchange between climate adaptation platforms. There's quite a lot of learning and sharing there. A lot of the platforms were sort of European and Canadian based, but lots of interesting stuff and very sophisticated tools, actually. And then CDCAN's just working now with the Global Resilience Partnership on a sort of resilience knowledge coalition to try and get global actors together to focusing on resilience, to try and, you know, take resilience to scale, supported by climate information. So the question being, like, what does this mean for us working in the global south and with developing countries? How can the open movement serve the interests of the decision makers and the NGOs and the private sector organizations we're working with? And what we are finding a lot of is that, yeah, format and process really matter. So this little simple poster that we did is in a local language, in local Namibian language, on the implications of 1.5 global warming for Namibia. And it's got like just a little bit on the science. It is the most recent science for different sub-regions of Namibia, and a little bit about what you can do and a little bit about the risks. And it's up in all the district official regional level offices, and people are really responding to it. And it's a very simple thing, but it's actually having quite a lot of impact, more impact than we expected. And then also just user driven. Really important that you know, the more user driven something is, often the more impact. And the East African Grain Council have also just launched a tool where they provide weather forecasts with different recommendations on when to start planting, harvesting, performing post-harvesting activities. And this is in East Africa. And this whole the tool arose from engaging with farmers, and it's been designed in response to the exact format and content that they require. So what does this all mean? Well, just from our vantage point as CDKN, is an enormous opportunity for the open movement to really, like, respond to this gap about more place-based, context-relevant knowledge, more available and more actionable. That is, from my perspective, where there's this real leverage point that we can respond to. We're very passionate about really getting climate experts and researchers in the South to contribute in a very active way, know how to engage with the open movement, learn how to contribute to platforms like Wikipedia. It's going to be a long process, but I think it's really something that can pay dividends. What I really think is so important, particularly with Wikipedia, is the ability to work across languages. And all our editathons have been in English because we haven't had the capacity or the bandwidth to do it any other way. But this is just, you know, in terms of this place-based knowledge, it's such an amazing opportunity. And then country level, you know, when I look at all the amazing open data platforms available at a global level, I just think about how can we make this work at a country level, and how can the open movement support this? And I know WRI has just launched a study on climate action and open data at country level. And one important point that I think that study did make was that because of the enhanced transparency framework of the Paris Agreement, it might be a good time now, actually, to really engage at a country level with open data, because countries have to get their transparency systems sorted. So yeah, I thought that was quite a nice sort of opportunity there. And again, for these national initiatives to work, really need to be engaging local researchers and expertise. And then some of the barriers, I think that there are, you know, we know there's still a lot of sort of bias towards knowledge and approaches from the North, and the digital divide. We just published a paper on the digital divide in the COVID crisis, and for the climate practitioners working in the global South, and how they've had to transition. And it's like we're dealing with some serious issues, and the gap is just getting. Although, you know, there have been strides made. So I say that, and I know that, you know, the world is rapidly changing, but some things still are very tricky to do in the global South. And then something that I have been grappling with a bit is this skepticism of researchers from the global south making their work freely available. When they do, you are coming with people with histories of colonial oppression. There's a lot of inequalities in the north-south research collaborations. So there's a mistrust of this open movement story, I think, amongst researchers, and how to deal with that. And then, just, a lot of sort of other barriers around awareness and capacity and technical capacity and legal frameworks, etc. But having said that, I still think, obviously there's enormous opportunity, but just being mindful of these barriers as we're going forward. And that's it from me.
Well, thank you, Lisa. This has been really enlightening, and I think that it matches really well with the call that we had last month, where there were some of the points that you're bringing up into this conversation were also made. So this is brilliant. Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, Alex, so now it's your time, and try to keep it brief. Go ahead.
Yeah, so thank you for doing this, and I'm really glad Lisa kind of put the context in it, because I approach this space from an activist role. Like I am an open activist, and so the problems, my method of addressing it is thinking about what is the role of the open organization, not so much how does, I don't start from the place that Lisa and Emma do at CDKN and their whole team of how do I work with the people on the ground who we already work with to think about the open space. So the kind of broad question I have is, where does Wikipedia play a role as an open platform? What does it do? And this all starts with a place in the Wikimedia movement that we believe Wikipedia and the other Wikimedia platforms are places to address topics for impact. So this is kind of the first place where I start with, which is when we do open, the most persuasive place to start is somewhere where there is impact through activism on the platform in some way. We've seen this with the Wikimedia movement. The gender gap has been really mobilizing for our communities and has brought a diversity of new projects into the movement, even in spaces that are not gender explicit. For example, a lot of our tactics for the Afro descent communities were kind of developed as kind of on the edges of the gender movement in the Wikimedia space. And so it's kind of interesting to think where are the activists, how do Wikipedia platforms kind of do this work, and how do we kind of use that to grow open content. So climate is of course really powerful. I did some data analysis last year looking at kind of where the climate and sustainability topics on Wikipedia were happening. And right before COVID, we were starting to see a spike of page views on English Wikipedia to these climate related topics. And then there was a crash. And so the public was looking at Wikipedia for climate information because climate activists were doing effective communication out there in public spaces, and people were asking questions. And then this is something we saw in the whole climate communication space. COVID kind of hid that conversation, and we're only now starting to see that recovery at the end of last year. And this is true on Wikipedia page views. We also know that unlike other topics, so usually English Wikipedia is the dominant source of page views in every shape and form on Wikipedia platforms. Usually it's over 50% of the page views. But we know on climate topics in particular, 60% of the page views are coming from other Wikipedias, other languages. So this shift towards really local content is really quite important. Now there's many more pages in these other languages than on English. So if you're just going to solve one thing, improving the English Wikipedia page hits more people, but all these other languages are really people are asking questions. And I was looking earlier at the Paris Agreement articles across different languages, and the Persian one is the third most popular page about the Paris Agreement. They're trying to the Farsi Persian language is only spoken by a relatively small part of the global population, but because there's not a lot of other climate knowledge in Persian, that those kinds of pages are really valuable. And so we were starting to see diverse community groups kind of organize around this. The CDKN event was kind of the one in 2019 was the one to kick it off. But we've seen kind of subsequent activity by a lot of community groups and NGOs and our local community. So on the bottom left, that's our organizers in Nigeria looking at climate activist articles, because that's something that you know, when the news hits about climate activism, people look for like, who is this person, right? Who is Vanessa Makate? Who is Disha Ravi in India? Who are these folks who are standing up against governments? And biographies are often a place where people start, but you also need to connect it to the science and to the politics. We did an experimental call to action in the last month or so with UN Human Rights and UN Environmental Program called Wiki for Human Rights that focused on like, how do we get the human dimension kind of reflected in the climate crisis through that right to a healthy environment framing. And it worked as far as we can tell. It's scaled up in a nice way from other events. We created over 800 articles from the UN identified list of topics. At least 300 more articles on climate, human rights, and other related topics on many Wikipedias. So this is a good example of where intersectional topics really worked. Macedonian Wikipedia did not have basic human rights articles. And so much of the content they created were like on other human rights topics, and they added that environmental perspective along the way. We also saw Wikimedia communities were able to convene a lot of different events, including a webinar on Arabic language television in Sweden this last weekend that had 3,500 people watching in Arabic from a Swedish context. And so we know that our communities are able to reach like new audiences, like as an open movement, because of this angle of sustainability and climate and human rights. And it's also allowing us to put kind of technical concepts into languages that probably would not be describing them. So on the right is the right to a healthy environment as a concept. And on the left is the Escazú Agreement, which is a major human rights treaty that just came into effect on Earth Day this last year in Latin America. And now the Escazú Agreement's in 17 languages. The concept of right to a healthy environment is in 24 languages. And, you know, English and French are the dominant page views for right to a healthy environment. But Russian Wikipedia is up there behind it, right? Interesting, a human right kind of frame in the Russian language is something that is of appeal to a broader public. So we're still learning though, like what is the best way to approach this? And to do this, I'm actually working on fictional personas right now based on the audiences we've interacted with. Like, who are these people that we either reach out to as organizers? So in the movement, we have organizers and editors. Organizers convene people, editors create content. And I'm trying to describe who we're seeing show up in these events so that other open communities, Wikimedia communities first, but also other open communities can kind of think about who is your audience for the doing part of this. What we're finding on the organizer side is more like journalists and activists and INGO folks like Lisa and Emma who are able to convene people in the like climate adjacent spaces. On the editor side, it's a mix of kind of youth activists and experts and kind of existing Wikimedia communities wanting to get engaged in these topics. And it's really an interesting mix that we haven't quite had outreach like this. Again, the best reference for it is the gender gap work, which has a much clearer target audience for the contribution. It's like women who want to see women's biographies reflected in the world, and that's like every woman. So it's a much broader kind of space. Whereas when we're thinking about these more targeted topic areas, like who are these folks? And we also have a challenge identifying like high impact that is not clearly science. A good example of this is like the Greta article and the David Attenborough articles on English Wikipedia drive like huge amounts of page views. It's like 500,000 page views a month. Like those aren't necessarily going to be impactful articles. Like David Attenborough and Greta Thunberg are very popular people, but that's not the information that makes like someone change their policy, get to the lowest kind of common denominator policy decision in like a country or a place. And so we're also finding these like national level articles, or some of these kind of more specialized ones like climate change in children are like have much fewer page views, but the kind of intended audience for it is much more impactful. And so finding the right balance between like, I need you to write an article about something really broad that we think will be in the news versus like something really local and impactful is the thing we're trying to figure out right now. And it's challenging to plan because the insight and tools for this is not something that like Wikimedia communities have. And it's not always transparent where the public is looking for climate information. So this is kind of like like a big platform like Wikipedia is not always in a good position to see this knowledge gap. So that's kind of my kind of brief introduction of what I'm thinking about. And I wanted to kind of, you know, whatever questions are in the room and dialogue, I think it's interesting to think about like where the kind of more practical implementation of this work that Lisa's doing kind of intersects with this kind of global perspective as a movement. Like, how do we create space for this kind of work? And Lisa, that article is brand new. It was written by one of the editors that participated in your event last fall. Actually, she came back for a Wiki for Human Rights.
Yeah, and also, like, interestingly enough, we also like someone translated it into Spanish, but it's kind of an interesting thing to see because they translated all without using the gender neutral form, so it reads really weird. So connecting gender and climate there too. Okay, so I don't know if there's any question on the chat. I didn't see any question there. I don't know if any one of the group wants to start or, you know, reflect a little bit on what Alex and Lisa shared.
Lisa, I'm really interested in kind of towards the end of your talk, you mentioned the mistrust and hesitancy of researchers in the Global South in participating in, you know, different places where open shows up. And I'm just wondering if you could reflect on that a bit more, and if you see any, sorry, I'm also managing the wait room. If you see any kind of direct strategies for, you know, how to address that, I guess.
Yeah, I think that I must say that in the editathons that we've had and the engagement with researchers, there's actually been by and large quite an open particularly from African researchers, quite an open attitude to sharing their work. But we're mainly, you know, dealing with academic literature as opposed to data. But I think when we're getting to the data realm, then it becomes a lot more tricky and proprietary. So I think it's a mixed bag. It's a mixed bag. But I think the issue is that, particularly, and this does happen in the climate research realm, is that there's often these big climate research programs and the southern partners are there to do the field work, or they're sort of like the data laboratories, and then the northern partners are often the leads. And, you know, the inequalities exist in that relationship. And there's a lot of power asymmetry. So I think there that, you know, in that kind of situation, researchers from the South one, they want to hold on to their data. They want to like really make sure that they're recognized for the work and the efforts. So I think that as long as there is that recognition, and that it's not transactional and not a sort of fly in, fly out mode and just like extractive, one can get it right. But I think it's just one needs to be very mindful of it, that it's not an apolitical space, that it does come with issues. And I just came across quite an interesting piece actually that I can share here. But this was mainly for the health sector, biomedical research, which is also different. So, but I thought it was well articulated how, yeah.
Lisa, I think you shared the like link to your folder.
Oh. Open data.
Something we've also seen in the larger Wikimedia movement is if you create space for the kind of activist types who are learners, they don't feel as much ownership of the topic space per se, and so they're also there to own. So like you need the experts for certain kinds of knowledge, and this is what was so good about like Lisa's editathons, but there's other kinds of knowledge that you can bring in through folks who are more generalist or like active learners. And so I think like part of the trick is finding the balance between like expert reviewed content and kind of like things that other people can communicate.
I think Kate has her hand up. So Kate, do you want to ask something?
Shannon, you had Luis going first?
Go ahead, and then Luis Felipe is after.
Okay, sure. I didn't want to cut and go off, Luis Felipe. Yeah, so hi everyone. Sorry, I'm a little late. I think I joined one of these before, and I primarily come from the ocean world, so I'll pretty much always be on all of your climate calls being like, it's the ocean, it's the entire climate also. So just assume that I've said that in multiple languages. But I'm really interested, Lisa, in this idea of Wikipedia as kind of a conceptual way to build confidence in working in an open way and creating data systems and getting valued for your contributions, you know, that open way of working. I was actually, the reason I was late is I was just on a big global ocean dialogue about building trusted ocean data systems using citizen science collaborations, and how do you build trust and how do you set up these trusted shared pieces. And one of the researchers who's part of the International Oceanographic Commission was talking about work that they did in Angola, where they went and worked with communities who weren't even that confident in their data. And he brought a team of scientists and data managers down to sort of work with them to say, you know, your data are good, your data have value. You shouldn't be intimidated by people who come in from anywhere and say your data aren't worth having. You know, you need to do these things to them, but, you know, there's these ways you can clarify and improve your data, but, you know, your data should be standing up against all of these other countries with their fancy northern logos and seals, and we should find a way for you to do that. So, you know, I am really curious about building these types, and I know Shannon is too, you know, like how do we actually build the systems that show people that they are getting recognized, they're getting value, but that in many cases, the data become more valuable in aggregate, right? Like we need to know that entire coastline, not just any one country. I mean, I live in the US and Rhode Island's a lovely state, but really their coastal data are not valuable. That's tiny, you know, it's 2 miles. We don't need your data, Rhode Island. We need, you know, 17 states who don't all get along. So it's, you know, other parts of of the world when we're talking about climate issues, we do need data collaborations. And I'm always looking for those models where people feel like they're getting recognized and not just getting their data kind of sucked into a pipeline where it doesn't get lost. So I'm just curious, if for anyone on this call, but for you, into like, how are we kind of creating that sense of value while still letting the data be, interoperable and findable, reusable? I don't have a good answer, but I'm going to put another example in the chat here too, of a project that a friend I know did for his PhD thesis in Mexico, which was trying to create data object identifiers and also encourage the community to tell stories about how they gathered the data. So it's both a comms platform and a data platform.
Very exciting. Yeah. I can respond if I think Max has got his hand up. No, I think that's fascinating, and I agree that I think Wikipedia is an incredible opportunity to do collaboration, and I think in doing that collaboration and seeing an immediate result, it's not that normally these collaborative projects you don't see immediate results, but you see immediate results on the page. That I think there's a lot of power in doing that and working with scientists in that way, and that's an incredible example that you've just given. So yes, concur and agree. And I don't know how we take it to scale. I still will think about how that works. I mean, I was very interested in the impact you had, Alex, with this last human rights. I mean, that's impressive stuff. And working out how to do that and take it to scale is really the trick. So yeah, really working out what the formula is, and we're still working it out.
Yeah, and so something. So my kind of space of work is campaigns in the Wikimedia space. Is like, how do you take something that works like at the editathon scale and turn it into something bigger while still being meaningful? And we've had this experience in the library professional space where we've needed to do like MOOCs, where we like give librarians skills that are relevant to their professional practice while teaching them Wikipedia. So this is very like opposite of where some of our community members want to do outreach, where they're like, we want to teach you Wikipedia while we do something valuable for you. And in the library space, we've done it the other way around. Like, what are the needs that librarians need? And how do we use Wikipedia to facilitate that? And so I'm in the process of funding a couple projects where we want to look at youth climate activists as like an audience like that, where it's like, what skills do youth climate activists need, right? Because a lot of them are doing communication about the science and the environmental movement and that kind of stuff, but they may not have like formal research training, or they may not know how to read a like scientific article, or they may not know where to look for high quality scientific information about the climate crisis that we're facing, right? So can you teach them those skills while teaching them to organize their communities to participate in an open space? And I suspect there's something similar for experts that we just haven't like figured out the formula. And this is a really good example of where I think the Wikipedia community tends to solve everything with like an editathon or like a generic partnership when they do outreach. And you really need to specialize in the audience. Like, what are you offering that audience in doing it? And so this is where like, open communities could learn. And I think, Kate, what you're talking about is that value add of the data part. I think we need to think about like, librarians need to understand how to explain to their patrons digital modes of knowledge production, right? Youth activists need to explain to their public, like decision makers, like, here's the basics of the science and this is where you can find out about it, right? And so for me, that's the place of interrogation, right? Is like, who are the audience and how do we give them things that are valuable, regardless of how they do it.
Great. Okay, so Luis Felipe, do you want to go ahead and ask your question away? No? Okay, so then I'll hand it over to Max. What's your question?
Yes, hi, thanks. I actually had a question for Lisa and for Alex, so I'm not sure if I should ask them both or sort of one at a time.
Just ask away. Yeah, I mean, maybe
actually, I think the question, Lisa, is probably sort of related to Wikipedia in some way as well. But first of all, it's great. I mean, I'm really excited to look through your project in more detail and sort of take a bit of a deeper dive to see where you more about what you're offering. But my main question really was about your sort of definition of sort of data poverty. And one of the key things that I feel is really needed in a lot of these conversations is the obviously access to data and the ability to sort of have decisions about what data is published is very important. But the resources that are needed, whether it's the technical skills or even the material resources, such as computing power, energy, etc., that are needed to actually do the analysis on that data, that kind of data poverty is one that I generally see is still quite lacking within the open community. A lot of it is about the licensing and the publishing of the data. And I feel that without looking at the other side of this poverty, which is the lack of resources to do something, to analyze the data, to build the machine learning models, etc., this just ends up feeding the incumbents, the ones with the big machines, you know, the big tech companies that are just able to really use this data for their own benefit without us being able to, us as an open movement and the communities that are producing this data really being able to benefit. So I don't know, I mean, Wikidata has, like, offers some of this in terms of its, you know, the ability to do some queries and all that kind of stuff, but the heavier lifting in terms of the machine learning infrastructure that's needed beyond just the source code, but I mean the actual physical infrastructure needed as an open community. I don't know if that's something that you've been looking at or not, or what are your thoughts on that? So that was my question primarily, as I said, to Lisa, but maybe Alex, you have some thoughts on that. And then I have a question for Alex as well about his presentation.
Sure, big question. I'm probably not best placed to, I don't have the expertise to answer it, comprehensively, but that is my sense from, sort of being exposed to the open community to a degree, and then working with decision problems, that it's getting from the data to the action is a very long and complicated chain. And never mind the computing power, it's the technical expertise to use, to curate, to manage, to keep that whole system going. And why I think, every national government that we work with really wants a platform. They want an uber wonderful platform that they can just put data in, data out, and get how they're going to implement X policy in this watershed. But I don't think we've cracked it. And I mean, I would be curious, I don't know where you work, but it would be interesting. Last week I was attending quite a few webinars of the climate adaptation CE for CAP program, where there's this sort of looking at collaboration of climate adaptation platforms, and I was really astounded at the level of sophistication. But these are for European users, and I think there were a few Australian platforms in there, but I just don't know if we, and I think it's problematic in that context. I mean, when I was listening to all the issues with just getting collaboration of users and producers, and it's complex data world, and doing that in a developing country context, I think. So I don't know if that answers your question, except to say that I think it's complicated, and it's to get to the decision level and for it to be useful and actionable is I'm not sure. Maybe Alex has maybe Wikidata.
I don't have an answer for this. We ran into a problem. So this is from my cultural heritage kind of partnership work that I did, where a group of our community in Ghana digitized a whole bunch of stuff from the National Archive, but there was no repository to store it. And they had to kind of like do a like open software evaluation of like what digital repository tools can we get, and they like had to go, you know, across Accra to a university library to get them to host the repository for the National Library. So like even when there were open solutions in a sector that is like about storing data, right? That's what libraries do. The kind of expertise and capacity did not live in one institution. And so that level of complexity is something that, you know, and this is where like talking to our practitioners in the Global South, just like we can't pick up a partnership model that works in one space, and this is probably true of open data and climate data and stuff, and like expect it to work elsewhere. Like we really need to start with like what is in your capacity and interest now, and how can we support that and validate that, and like just endorse it. And so like one of the examples is our Philippines community has been doing a lot of translation work on Wikipedia, using the machine translation that we have been able to get access from, like Google and the various other big providers of machine translation. And like that has been super valuable to them, because extreme weather in the Philippines is a big deal, and like local language context information about that is just not available, right? And so that kind of work, you know, we provide some centralized infrastructure that unlocked the ability for folks to do the thing locally.
Max, do you want to go ahead and ask your other question that you had?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, no, thanks for the feedback, Lisa and Alex. And I think, yeah, it is. I mean, yeah, I wish, obviously, if I had answers, you know, I'd be putting them forward. But I think, I mean, one of the things I just wanted to mention that comes to mind is actually the work of DataKind in the UK. I don't know if you, I think they work in the US and the UK. Datakind.org.uk is their website, and they do some work towards bridging the knowledge gap of helping organizations work with data. But again, it's, I mean, that which I think is a very interesting model, that I wonder like how that can be applied in different in different areas. But it's still, I mean, you know, that big one about infrastructure is I think, you know, that maybe is something that sort of needs a UN level organization, just because of the sheer cost and you know, resources that are needed.
Can I maybe add a response to that quickly, which is, I'm not sure if anyone else, how much other folks have worked with the Open Data Institute in the UK, which also does a lot of data literacy training. But we've been having, and when I say we, I'm putting on my hat of working with the World Economic Forum and the UN Decade for the Ocean. We've been having some initial conversations with them about translating some of their work on data ethics and data strategy, some of their existing trainings, to be specifically for people working on coastal and ocean resilience issues, and can we also translate them into multiple languages? So I'm curious if anyone else has worked with them or thought about repurposing their tools, because one reason that we are looking at doing this with those groups is that the international development banks, the Global Economic Fund, some of these other investment banks are sort of saying, well, if you can tell me what Trinidad needs for a coastal ocean data system, we will fund it. But until they can tell us, you know, what they're looking to build. So it's a little bit of a chicken and egg situation. So we're wondering if we can use things like, you know, we could use, whether it's working with DataKind or ODI or somebody who sort of already has these trainings in like data strategy and data system assessment, to see, you know, we want to monitor this. This is what we care about. This is what we want to build. It's going to cost us this much money. Who's in? Because we're hearing more and more that people, public and private, are in for that. If someone could just articulate it as a shopping list.
I mean, I do want to make a small point about like being very careful when we talk about like sort of like, and I know that Max is right about it, sort of saying, you know, there's like a problem with the gap between the like computing power and all those things. But I also want to be like caution, like bring a word of caution around like treating everything as if it were the same, right? Because there are like, you know, there are small countries that really struggle with like getting this data set, but then there are like, you know, middle income countries too that do have some capacity installed, right? So like I want to just be caution about like putting everyone like that is in the global south into the same bag of things, right? Of like lacking, you know, capacity and resources, right? I do think that there's also, you know, coming from like Latin America, I know that there's like some governments are very cautious whenever it comes to dealing with NGOs and like this sort of institutes, right? So they rather do stuff through other partnerships and alliances that they already know of, like, you know, the Open Government Partnership, I think that's one of them. And like the climate, like the cities for climate, I think that they are also like sharing data through those like spaces. But yeah. So Max, do you want to ask your last question for Alex, or?
Sure. Yeah, if I'm just checking, nobody else has their hands up. Yeah, it's okay. Just a quick one, actually, because Alex, I know you and I have had conversations about this in the past, but I think what I found really interesting about what you said was the way in which you found a lot of people were using Wikimedia as a way to sort of look up activists in these networks, especially in areas where, you know, non-English language, and where it might sort of be a little bit more difficult to find information about these activists elsewhere. And I was wondering, I mean, as you know, we've talked about this before, but you have certain language communities, such as Wikipedia Arabic is the one that I'm familiar with, that are that has a very sort of deletionist type of approach towards articles, and a lot of activists in a lot of areas. I can't speak for climate activism actually, but I know that in a lot of other areas we've talked about, a lot of activists just get their pages deleted before they even get started because of the approach of the admins in that language. And I was just wondering if that's something that you think the way that you approached your analysis, it can surface sort of correlations between these kinds of uses, which I think are great uses of Wikipedia, and sort of the language communities that have more of a deletionist versus an inclusionist type of approach.
This is part of the reason I want to get away from biography writing and the movement more generally, because like who is relevant is a political choice in most contexts, and even the like gender gap community gets work, but it's very hard to pivot towards the kinds of work that Lisa and Emma were doing, because you have to recruit the right audience, right? You have to have the right experts in the room to write all of the climate stuff about, you know, the whole continent of Africa versus like a country level thing. And so the Elizabeth von Munch, who helps organize the Wiki for Climate event and the Wikiloads SDGs event, and I have been experimenting a lot with how do you find topics that are in that medium complexity space in this topic domain. Like what's the thing between the biography and like the main climate change adaptation article that like would make meaningful impact. And we're trying to pivot towards that. But the tools for doing that are not there in the Wikimedia community yet. So it's still very artisan. You still have to like have a gift at finding those topics to like set up the conditions for newcomers to participate and experts to participate in that. So yeah, and Lisa, I don't know, like what was your experience with kind of finding the right topics with the right impact for the audience you wanted to recruit for this stuff?
It was quite a process, I have to say. I'm just so glad you and Elizabeth were around. I mean, Emma's silently. Yeah, we worked hard. We worked hard on that. We had to really think about it very carefully. And, I mean, even saying that, I think we do things maybe a little bit differently next time. But there's a balance between, those articles that are really high impact versus those that are more kind of doable, and that you won't likely have your edits reversed.
And I think the nice thing about the environmental topics is that they're like globally acceptable to deal with. Like maybe 5-10 years ago, that might not have been the case. But now it is, with like some very particular exceptions, politically opposed mining situations in very particular countries, or that kind of stuff. For the most part, and especially amongst our volunteers who are kind of news savvy, like the environmental issues are less, like the thing about it is it's like a well-documented set of knowledge that has a very clear articulate gap on our platforms, which I think is very different than like if you were to work on LGBTQ issues or other human rights topics like free speech. You might end up in a like, do I trust your documentation or not argument, which is not where you want to start newcomers in an open knowledge space like this, right?
Great. We are reaching the top of the hour. This has been great. And I mean, I still have like a lot of questions around, connecting this like sort of local evidence on the platform, and then how that actually translates into climate action, right? But I guess that's something that we can leave for some other call or some other conversation.
Great topic for another call.
Well, initially these were only going to be 6 calls, but we might need to extend them. Who knows, right? Well, thank you, Lisa and Emma and Alex for being here, and to all the other participants for being here too, and bringing so many interesting questions. And please remember that you can find all the information about the calls on the Appropedia page that we have shared there. And yeah, watch out the space for our next call that is gonna happen, if I don't remember incorrectly, on the 22 of June?
29th
Yes.
of June.
22.
29th.
Or 29th. Okay, right, 29th. So see you all there on the 29th of June.
Great, thanks for the opportunity. Nice to meet
Thank
you all.
you.